Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. Carl Jung, Chapter 1, The Pattern You Can't Explain. Why do some people repeatedly end up in toxic relationships, while others seem to recognize unhealthy people almost immediately? Is it simply bad luck? Poor judgment? Or is there a deeper psychological pattern that quietly influences who we trust and who we fall in love with? In this video, we'll explore why toxic relationships often begin long before you meet the toxic person. Drawing on Carl Jung's psychology, attachment theory, and modern research, you'll discover how childhood experiences shape your emotional instincts, why unhealthy behavior can feel strangely familiar, and most importantly, how to recognize these unconscious patterns before they lead you into another painful relationship. Most people believe that toxic relationships begin the moment someone starts manipulating, controlling, or emotionally hurting their partner. In reality, those behaviors usually appear much later. The beginning often feels exciting, safe, and surprisingly familiar. That sense of familiarity is exactly what makes these relationships so difficult to recognize, because our brain is wired to interpret what feels familiar as something trustworthy, even when it isn't healthy. This is why many people leave one painful relationship only to find themselves in another that looks different on the surface but follows the same emotional pattern. They assume they keep attracting toxic people, when in reality, the deeper question is whether their nervous system has learned to confuse familiarity with safety. To understand why this happens, we need to go back much further than your last relationship. We need to look at the emotional environment in which your understanding of love, safety, and connection was first created. Chapter 2, Your Childhood Wrote the First Draft. To understand why certain relationships feel so natural, we first need to understand how the human brain learns what love looks like. Contrary to what many people believe, we aren't born knowing how to recognize healthy relationships. We learn them by observing the people who raise us. Long before we can explain our emotions, our nervous system is already collecting information about what connection, safety, conflict, and affection feel like. If love was consistent, respectful, and emotionally safe, your brain gradually learned that relationships are places where you can relax, express yourself, and trust another person. But if love was unpredictable, conditional, or emotionally unavailable, your brain adapted in a very different way. It learned that love requires constant attention, self-sacrifice, or emotional vigilance. This adaptation is incredibly important because the brain is not designed to seek what is healthy. Its first priority is to seek what is familiar. From an evolutionary perspective, familiarity increases the chances of survival. If you've spent years growing up in a certain emotional environment, your nervous system begins to treat that environment as normal, even if it was painful. This is why someone who grew up with emotionally unpredictable parents may later feel strangely comfortable with a partner whose affection is inconsistent. One day, they feel deeply loved. The next day, they are ignored or criticized. To an outside observer, these emotional highs and lows are obvious warning signs. But to the person experiencing them, they may simply feel familiar. The same pattern appears in many different forms. A child who learned that love had to be earned may become an adult who constantly tries to prove their worth in relationships. Someone who was praised only when they met other people's expectations may struggle to set boundaries, fearing that saying no will lead to rejection. Another person may become intensely attracted to emotionally distant partners because, on an unconscious level, distance feels like something they have spent their entire life trying to overcome. This doesn't mean your childhood permanently determines your future. It means your earliest experiences become the blueprint your brain uses until you consciously decide to question it. Psychology calls these unconscious expectations internal working models, They quietly influence how we interpret other people's behavior, what we tolerate, and even who we find attractive. The difficult truth is that chemistry is not always a sign of compatibility. Sometimes it is simply recognition. Your nervous system recognizes an emotional pattern it has known for years and mistakes that recognition for connection. Understanding this difference is one of the most important steps in breaking unhealthy relationship patterns. Because once you realize that familiar and healthy are not always the same thing, you begin to see your relationships through an entirely different lens. And this is exactly where Carl Jung takes the conversation even deeper. He believed that many of the people who fascinate us are not simply entering our lives by chance. They awaken unconscious parts of ourselves that have been waiting to be seen for years. Chapter 3. What Carl Jung understood about attraction. Carl Jung believed that we rarely fall in love with another person alone. More often, we fall in love with the meaning our unconscious mind attaches to that person. This idea may sound strange at first, but it explains why two people can meet the exact same individual and have completely different emotional reactions. One person immediately notices manipulation, emotional distance, or controlling behavior and decides to walk away. Another feels an intense connection and believes they have finally met someone special. The difference is not necessarily the person they met. The difference is the emotional lens through which they see them. Jung described this process as projection. Projection happens when we unconsciously assign our own unmet needs, hidden fears, or unhealed wounds to another person. Instead of seeing them as they truly are, we see the story our unconscious mind wants to believe. This is one of the reasons toxic relationships often begin with extraordinary intensity. We don't just see another human being. We see hope. We see rescue. We see the possibility that this person will finally give us the love, validation, or security we have been searching for since childhood. The problem is that no relationship can survive the weight of expectations it was never meant to carry. When another person becomes responsible for healing wounds they did not create, disappointment becomes almost inevitable. The relationship slowly shifts from connection to dependency, from mutual respect to emotional survival. Jung also believed that every person carries a shadow, the parts of ourselves we have learned to reject, suppress, or hide because we believed they were unacceptable. For some people, that shadow contains anger. For others, it contains vulnerability, confidence, or the ability to set boundaries. Interestingly, we are often fascinated by people who express qualities we have buried within ourselves. Someone who is confident may seem irresistible to a person who has spent their entire life seeking approval. Someone who appears emotionally dominant may seem attractive to a person who has never felt emotionally secure. At first, these qualities feel magnetic, but if they are expressed without empathy or respect, admiration can slowly become control. This is why emotional chemistry should never be the only reason to trust someone. Chemistry tells you that something feels familiar or exciting. It does not tell you whether it is healthy. Perhaps the most important lesson Jung offers is this: self-awareness changes attraction. The more deeply you understand your own fears, emotional wounds, and unconscious patterns, the less likely you are to mistake emotional intensity for genuine intimacy. You stop asking, "Why do I always attract toxic people?" And you begin asking a much more powerful question: what inside me keeps mistaking familiar pain for love? That question doesn't blame you for your past. It gives you the power to change your future. Chapter 4. Breaking the pattern. Understanding why you keep repeating the same relationship patterns is an important first step. But understanding alone doesn't change your life. Insight is powerful, yet it only becomes transformative when it begins to influence your decisions. Many people leave a toxic relationship convinced that the next one will be different simply because they have learned what red flags look like. But awareness is only the beginning. The real challenge comes much earlier, in the quiet moments when you first meet someone new. At the start of every relationship, your mind asks one question while your nervous system asks another. Your mind asks, "Do I like this person?" Your nervous system asks, "Does this feel familiar?" And very often, it is the second question that quietly decides the future of the relationship. This is why healing is not about becoming better at identifying toxic people. It is about becoming more aware of your own automatic responses. Instead of asking why someone is so attractive, pause and ask yourself, what exactly feels so compelling? Is it kindness, emotional maturity, and mutual respect? Or is it uncertainty, emotional intensity, and the hope that this time you will finally receive the love you once fought so hard to earn? One of the clearest signs of healing is that your definition of chemistry begins to change. Relationships built on emotional stability may initially feel less exciting because your nervous system is no longer responding to chaos. Many people mistake this calmness for boredom, when in reality they are experiencing something unfamiliar, emotional safety. Healthy love rarely feels like an emotional roller coaster. It does not require you to constantly prove your worth, chase someone's attention, or ignore your own needs to preserve the relationship. It creates space for honesty, boundaries, and mutual respect without making you feel guilty for having them. Carl Jung believed that we cannot change what remains unconscious. The patterns that control us are often the ones we refuse to examine. But once they become visible, they gradually lose their power. Every time you recognize an old emotional pattern before acting on it, you weaken it. Every healthy boundary you set becomes evidence that your past no longer has to dictate your future. Perhaps the goal was never to stop attracting difficult people. Every one of us will meet manipulative, emotionally unavailable, or unhealthy individuals throughout life. The real goal is to become someone who no longer mistakes emotional instability for love, who no longer feels responsible for fixing everyone they meet, and who has the courage to walk away from relationships that demand the sacrifice of their own peace. Because the moment you stop searching for the love that feels familiar, you finally create space for the love that is healthy. Thank you for watching Architecture of Emotions. If this video gave you a new perspective on your own relationship patterns, consider subscribing for more explorations of psychology, Carl Jung, philosophy, and the hidden emotional forces that shape our lives. And before you leave, I'd like to ask you one question. Have you ever mistaken emotional intensity for genuine love? Sometimes the first step toward breaking an unhealthy pattern is simply recognizing that it exists.